What's up everyone, Alex here. So a few weeks ago, I posted a prompt in the community tab asking you to post gaming questions that you'd like me to answer. What's cool about this is that you guys actually posted a lot of really serious stuff alongside questions that kind of asked what my preferences were, and I really truly appreciated that. So I actually picked 10 of these questions to answer today, and if for some reason I haven't answered any questions that you posted in that community tab post your question again in the comments below, and if you want me to elaborate on any of the answers that I had today, please let me know in the comments below and maybe we can spin it off in its own video, alright? So because I asked for gaming questions, some people asked me a bunch of behind the scenes channel stuff, and to be quite honest, I'm not really in the mood to answer those right now, but you can join my Patreon at patreon.com/backlogbattle if you want to ask those questions in the many behind the scenes posts that I actually talk about with regards to the videos that I make on this channel. So without any further ado, let's get into the 10 questions that I'm going to be answering today. So the first question I want to answer today is by RedStratus97, and they ask, what is your personal favorite JRPG of all time? And I love this question to start because it really sets the tone for the rest of the video, and I'm just going to say it right now, it is Persona 4 Golden. Now, I know that there have been plenty of other really good games that have come out after Persona 4, as well as before actually. In fact, on my 10 out of 10 video list, I actually put Final Fantasy 6 at the very last, not necessarily because it's the best, but the game just has a special place in my heart. But Persona 4 and Persona 4 Golden in general came at a time when I was just really down on JRPGs. It is literally single-handedly the JRPG that brought me back to the genre full force. The one that really made me realize that, you know what? JRPGs don't just have to be Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. And keep in mind, I know of Persona's existence because I was actually one of the first people who got Revelations Persona on the PS1. But Persona 4 was really the first of the modern era Personas that I really picked up and gravitated towards, because also Atlas packed an art book and a soundtrack with it that really kind of made me feel like, oh, I'm getting my money's worth by getting this game. But instead, what I got as a game was not only a dark anime storyline that features serial killers, which I was really big into at the time, but also this sense of identity that was prevalent throughout the entire game. Now, at the time that I actually played the game, there was a lot more positive sentiment of what was going on inside the game, and maybe it was just within my circle. But regardless of the kind of essays that a lot of people have written about Persona 4, especially of the modern era, I still feel that those perspectives are just as valid as the experience that I had, because there was nothing really malicious that I got from Persona 4 apart from its creators just kind of genuinely reflecting what they know of identity based on their own experience and from the people around them. And of course, beyond 2008, when the game first came out, there's also a lot of talk about gender identity and sexuality that became a lot more fully formed, that simply you can't just go back in time and tell those people hey, times have changed in this day and age. You know, all the stuff that you made back in 2008 is now completely outdated. Nonetheless, the experience that I had playing the game also was mind-boggling in that I actually never liked procedurally generated dungeons, but this one I really enjoyed the kinds of motifs that they kind of explored, and it worked really well for the kinds of stories that they were telling at the time. But anyways, I have talked enough of Persona 4 just now to fill an entire video, so like I said, if you want me to talk about this game more, let me know in the comments below. But that is my answer for the first question. This next question is by Ivan Raphael 7644, and they ask, do you have any tips to help someone focus on the game that they're playing and not think about the next one? Well, it's pretty simple actually. You just don't buy the next one. Now, this is difficult because a lot of people feel that they have to be, there on day one for the zeitgeist. But even as a YouTuber, I actually don't take on projects or even games that, one, I'm not interested in, and two, I just simply don't have time for. And this should be the same for anybody that plays video games, because this isn't like back in the day in the 80s or 90s where game releases were more sparse. And I think the reason why there were more sparse back in the day isn't because there weren't a lot of games coming out. It's actually because our parents and our loved ones couldn't really afford to buy every single game out there. As such, we should adopt the same model. We can't buy every single game out there. So instead, let's rely on people like YouTubers like myself or even reviewers to figure out what the next game should be. But more importantly, what we should do is to focus on the game that we're playing right now and really try to immerse ourselves as much as we can in that adventure. Because it's always tempting to look at the next shiny big thing, and so because of that, that takes us away from what we're currently working on and making us move to the next one. Instead, we should just focus on what we have in front of us, finish it, enjoy it, revel in it, and then figure out what our next game should be. That is the more responsible way to do it, and I hope this advice helped. This next question is by Gray Mars 1097, and they ask, be honest, is there any actual reason for someone to buy a PS5? I love this question. I actually love this question so much that I'm not answering it in this video, and I'm actually saving it for a future video. And this is actually going to be a very unique video because I'm approaching it from the perspective of a Japanese/JRPG fan. So if you don't want to miss that video, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of my notifications, whether it's a community tab post or a new video, or this upcoming one. Gamer Emporium asks, in a general sense, what do you do for a living to support your RPG habit? Well, you're watching it. So I know I said that there was not going to be any sort of behind the scenes stuff, but I wanted to kind of clarify this and say that this is my full-time job. I'm not doing anything else. I'm not Ubering. I'm not like door dashing or anything else. This is my job. This allows me to actually play all of these lengthy games and also deliver the best content that I could possibly give you. And it also allows me to ruminate on what I've made for the channel as well. It's actually the cyclical process. A lot of people think that content creation and streaming is a really easy gig. My work is actually 90% of what you don't see on the channel, which is a lot of emails, talking to contacts, negotiating schedules and stuff, and even collaborating with people. It's actually a very social kind of activity. But to go back to the actual question, the games that I get, the RPGs that I choose to play, I get them for free thanks to this channel. But again, I didn't start this channel just by getting freebies. I actually wanted to play games that I was interested in and cover them on this channel. Just so happens that most of them were JRPGs. And over time, as I grew in notoriety, a lot of people started reaching out to me and saying like, hey, can you cover our game? Here's a key, here's a key. And of course, there's also patreon.com/backlogbattle where you can actually support me financially because, as you might imagine, because this is my job, this also pays the bills. So not every single ad revenue or Patreon actually goes into the games or the production because I still need to pay bills. I have a mortgage to pay and utilities to pay, for crying out loud. So yes, back in the day, it was a lot of gifts, and nowadays it's a lot of freebies. So this question by Racially Confused is very interesting because they asked the question in Filipino, and Racially Confused actually knows that I'm Filipino, so I'm gonna read it in Filipino first and then translate it for you. So they ask, bakit yung Square Enix hindi nire-release yung Xenogears HD remake? Hindi ba nila alam na maraming mga fans ang naghihintay dun? This translates to, why isn't Square Enix remaking Xenogears in HD? Don't they know that there's a lot of fans waiting for it? For one, I don't think that Square Enix isn't aware that there's a huge fan base for Xenogears. In fact, I actually think it's the opposite. I actually think that Square Enix knows that there's a lot of people who are fans of Xenogears, and it's because of that that they're very careful to hire out a company or internally to work on this game because they want to make it as good as it possibly can be. If you look at like the remaster of Chrono Cross, which actually contained the Radical Dreamers storyline from the Super Famicom disk system, that took a lot of thought into trying to figure out like, okay, can we actually do do this? Can we make this into a meaningful package that's not just a remaster of a game that existed a long time ago? Because consider this, what if this Xenogears HD remake actually had all the cut content that was in the original game before they actually had to polish it down and optimize it? Wouldn't you want to also involve the people who were actually responsible for both the story and everything else in the game, so that way they could actually have input on what this final Xenogears remaster is going to look like? Because look at what they also did with Saga Frontier. They actually reintroduced a scenario that was not there in the original release. So who's to say that that's actually something that they want to do for Xenogears? But the most important thing is that they do not rush it, because you don't want a game that is completely rushed just to appease an existing audience. You want to be very thoughtful in taking care of the fan base and really giving them something that they could talk about for years on end. And what better way to actually make people talk than to release content that was not there before and making it part of the entire experience? So that's just my thoughts on this. I don't have an inside contact on Square Enix, so I can't deny or confirm any of these things. This is just the perspective of somebody who, if given the opportunity, that's what I would do for Xenogears, is I would really try to dig deep and see what's actually created and maybe make this re-release a lot more special than just like, hey, here's the PS1 game again, you know? Like, there's something cool you can make than just like remastering something. Square Enix knows this. Letter M6656 asks, what are your thoughts on video game censorships? So when I was growing up, censorship was all about removing religion, kind of like biblical religious kind of iconography or referencing, and maybe some nudity, overt nudity. That happened a lot on the Nintendo era, especially on Nintendo platforms, which is how Sega differentiated themselves from Nintendo. Even back in the day when there was quote-unquote censorship, what actually happened was we got two different versions of games that were actually very interesting because of the different context that these changes provided, right? Let me give you Castlevania 3 as a really good one. So in Castlevania 3, in the Japanese version, there's a lot more crucifixes and all that stuff that was actually present in the original. But one more thing that they actually delivered was this really cool chipset that actually delivered better music. Because people didn't use CDs back in the day, it was a lot of games on chips. And in Japan, a lot of developers were actually able to use custom chips in order to deliver a unique experience compared to everybody else. Compared to MMC5, which is basically the American version of Castlevania 3, the music is still good, but it's slightly different, and all of the religious iconography were removed. Now, when you go to modern day, it's a lot of like, oh, there's a lot of sexy stuff that got removed. And a lot of modern video game censorship is complaining about like how people's thirst aren't being fulfilled. And to be quite honest, while I'm not a fan of censorship in general, I do find that the reason why this exists goes beyond denying people's thirsts. There are government, societal, and cultural reasons why certain things don't get released 100% the same in one country or another, for example. And you can see this in TV and movies. And quite honestly, it's a lot less censorship than more like, hey, we want to get this game in the market that we want to release this in. And to me, at the end of the day, if the game gets released in, the United States by tweaking a few things, I personally don't care, because I get to play the game localized and I don't have to do a bunch of patching, play it on PC, patched with a fan translation and whatnot. I'm getting the game, period, end of story. So that's my take on video game censorship. Aurelix4912 asks, after playing so many JRPGs, is there any trope in JRPG stories that you're tired to see? I'm not tired per se, because not a lot of games actually have this yet, but there's a really bad habit that's happening right now where you finish a story and you're like, oh cool, there's a post game, and literally the post game is the extension of the main story. 3 games come to mind when it comes to this: Octopath Traveler 1 and 2 and Dragon Quest XI, with Dragon Quest XI being the most egregious one. Now, before anything else, I want to say that I love all 3 of these games, but let's not pretend that the post-game isn't part of the main story. All of these post-games are related to the main story and are just as important in actually appreciating the entire game. And I think the reason why I'm so adamant about this is because this is different from back in the day where there's post-game content that was actually found before the last boss. So it's like, hey, here's Ruby Weapon. Why don't you try to kill Ruby Weapon or something, or Omega Weapon and some such, And while those aren't necessarily post-game implies to me that there's a tougher challenge at the end. But if you're expecting people to go through that post-game, quote unquote, in a way, because that's technically part of the main story, well, is it really post-game? Like, is post-game defined by the fact that credits rolled? Because I can tell you that if that's the case, all the other playthroughs of Nier Automata were post-game, which is really silly to me. So that's a trend that I really, really hope people stop. Just because the credits roll doesn't mean that everything that comes after that is post-game. Please, just call it what it is. FemTrooper asks, what is a JRPG world you would most like to visit? This might feel like a cop-out because it does exist in real life, but I'm interested in Persona 5's world because, you have mementos, you have all these different palaces. Like, imagine those palaces kind of like a theme park ride, Like, I think that would be really fun to kind of experience in that sort of sense. And a majority of Persona 5 really is rooted in Japan. I've been to Japan 3 times my entire life, and I've loved every single moment of it. I've seen that country change so many times over the past few years that while I don't necessarily understand or read the language well yet, I really appreciate seeing it kind of grow over time. And I think Persona 5 kind of allowed me to experience modern Japan in a very different way that made us all virtual tourists. Xeon Lover asks, what are your thoughts about the video game industry going to a digital-only model? Now, full disclosure, a lot of my games these days are digital. That's because my wife and I don't really want to clutter our house with a lot of games. And that's not to say that I don't advocate for physical collecting. I think physical collecting is a truly amazing and important thing for the industry because something tangible is pretty important. I don't necessarily think that the entire industry is going to move away from physical, because if you do, you're actually ignoring a huge part of the world that hasn't really gotten into video games yet. And there are countries that are like that. And you're targeting nations that have internet access that isn't metered, really. Because let's face it, for the rest of us who are living in countries that have metered internet, meaning people gauge like how many gigabytes you download and how much you have limits every month and stuff, it's not going to be tenable for people to just download everything digitally. So my thought on this is that I feel like this is very short-sighted for the industry because, like for example, Brazil was one of the newer markets that the PS4 and PlayStation and all these other companies were trying to penetrate. But the internet over there isn't as good as something as the United States in many areas. So to only serve digital-only games to those markets is a little bit short-sighted. However, I live in the United States, so we have really good internet here that is mostly not metered, unless you're in Canada and you're Rogers, that is metered from what I remember. And a digital-only console makes a lot of sense. That's why we have a PS5 that is digital-only, as well as an Xbox that is digital-only. That being said, I don't want physical to stop being sold because there's something special about unwrapping a present during Christmas Day or during your birthday and then realizing like, hey, look, it's a video game that I can literally pop into my console right now. There is nothing more exciting about unwrapping something physically and seeing it in your hands, and then you pop it into your console and seeing it like just unfurl. Yes, a lot of us have transitioned to the digital model, myself included, but admittedly, I long for the days of just being like, hey, here's a physical copy, open it up, my face glows because I opened something truly special, and then I lose myself in video games for 40 to 50 hours after that. This next question is by Roykin7337, and they ask, do you think the industry will ever make an effort to go back to its roots? Now, this was kind of an ambiguous question, so I want to kind of paraphrase what they mean by this. They really mean that when you compare newer titles to older titles, newer titles have excessive amounts of detail. Now, I know Roy said that they don't have a lot of detail, but it's actually the opposite. There's actually way too much detail in games these days. And when you compare these newer titles to older titles, where detail is actually very sparse, right? It's in choice areas, like Metal Gear Solid 2, for example, where you were shooting like a bunch of boxes of produce and those would spill out, for example. Or in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, where you go into this confessional and you don't know what you're gonna get based off of the confessional. These are small details that can get easily lost in today's day and age because it's so commonplace. So what Roy's really asking, probably, is where is the focus for game design going to come back? Because let's face it, while Starfield is a great game for a lot of people, the fact that you can make a Rube Goldberg machine in there doesn't really speak to the kinds of experiences that you can go to in space in that game. It's like, that's a neat detail, but how does that add to the gameplay? And the real answer is it doesn't. It actually makes games excessively expensive. I actually want to bring up something that was brought up recently in interviews with a lot of developers, which is that video game development is now going to last between 4 to 6 years. That's crazy to me because if you think about the console cycle is typically 5 to 7 years. So what this means usually is that in order to have, like, I don't know, an Assassin's Creed coming out every single year, you need to have at least 2 or 3 teams working non-stop in order to deliver a new Assassin's Creed game every single year. So instead of that, we're now maybe gonna get like one every other year or some such, depending on who is actually involved in it. And within those 4 to 6 years, a lot of people are going to move from job to job because they don't want to get burnt out by what they're working on, meaning a lot more people's hands are actually going to be touching the game that you're going to be playing. But moreover, I'm not sure I'm okay with Naughty Dog, for example, only making one game per generation, because I know that back in their heyday, they were able to make some really truly impressive stuff more often than not. And I think we're kind of getting stuck in this situation where now, because of bigger budgets, we have to make the most photorealistic thing. And, that's a trap. A company that doesn't fall into that trap, that still makes really good games? Nintendo. Look at Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, and how you're able to create things using very simple rule sets that exist in that world. And yes, you can make a Rube Goldberg like in Starfield. But in Zelda, it's relevant because you can do a whole bunch of other stuff with the physics engine. That makes the game much more than just a single-player adventure. It becomes a form of expression, meaningful expression through gameplay. This is one of the reasons why I love Japanese developers, is because even a company like Capcom making Resident Evil almost every single year for the past 3 or 4 years, right? They are able to make that game and make it profitable and make people actually enjoy it. They're not breaking their back like trying to make these really huge worlds or making things too photorealistic. They know how to focus on the parts that are important, which is one of the reasons why I absolutely love Capcom as a developer, because they really know how to budget things properly and still make money and make fun games. So I know I went on that rant, but that's my thoughts on this because I think it's very important to lay out there and for people to know. The last question is by Anika, and they ask, what has been your favorite combat systems or mechanics in any game, turn-based or action-based, so far? Now, I love this question because this is truly multifaceted, because depending on what you ask, I actually have a different answer. Now, this doesn't mean that my answer will change depending on who asks, but what kind of question is asked. So immediately, just going with my gut, if we're talking about a combat system that is turn-based, that's very snappy and very responsive, Final Fantasy X easily wins that for me. If you play that game now, even remastered, you will notice how snappy that battle system is. Yes, Blitzball be damned, that's actually a really bad turn-based system, but the actual combat itself, being able to swap characters in and out, not having to wait for an ATB meter, and just literally like saying, hey, it's your turn now, put your freaking command in, and your character will just do it right then and there. It's so satisfying that even in today's day and age, the only things that would rival that sort of snappiness and responsiveness is an action game. And that's why Final Fantasy X's turn-based system is like one of my favorites in terms of its responsiveness and snappiness. Now, in terms of retro flair, I have to give it to the Octopath series, more so for Octopath Traveler 2 in terms of its turn-based gameplay. Now, I really love that game. It's been no surprise that I even put it in my 10 out of 10 JRPGs list. It truly is a fantastic game with some really creative uses of the job system. They literally took a job system, which has been a staple of tons of Square Enix games for literal years, and injected it with so much energy and flavor that it makes it so much fun to play. And in Octopath Traveler 2, they made it even better by actually considering every single use case for that particular job across its entire batch of jobs that's available. In terms of action RPGs, that's very tricky because I have two. One is actually Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana. It's just this free-for-all, frenetic, fast-paced game that is really fun, great exploration and everything. And in terms of like just mechanical complexity and just outright streamlined action gameplay, I would have to give it to Tales of Arise. Now, a lot of people would otherwise think that I would pick like something like Tales of Berseria, but I think what Tales of Arise does that Berseria does not is that it knows when to say stop. And that's not a knock on Berseria. Berseria has some really deep intertwining systems, but I'm also 45 years old now. I'm getting to a point where I'm getting really impatient when it comes to being in menus too long. And again, no knock on anybody who loves that kind of stuff. I still have my moments. But in Tales of Arise, you can get back into the action so fast that they also made a lot of the switching options between the characters just available in real time right then and there. And the biggest challenge, and I feel like nobody has actually tried to meet this as far as Tales fans are concerned, is to be able to do a lengthy combo from one character and involving every single character that's in the party or even out of the party. That to me is like one of the most fun things about Tales of Arise, and if you can do that, I'd love to see footage of it because it is such a fantastic and satisfying thing that I'm really sad that I didn't record when I actually did it. I love the battle system of Odin's Sphere, Leifthrazir, and Muramasa, of course, the beat-em-up gameplay of Dragon's Crown, and Nier Automata, because Nier Automata's gameplay is absolutely phenomenal. For tactical games, I love 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim because they were able to split the gameplay with the storytelling, so you can involve yourself with the story as much as you can and the gameplay as much as you can. I also really like the Valkyria Chronicles series, especially since it has this real-time element to it. Triangle Strategy is what I like when it comes to like more retro style tactical RPGs. I'll even lump in Front Mission 3, the original on the PS1, as one of my favorites. And this will probably change because it's coming out next year, so I don't know if it's good or not, but Vanillaware's next tactical RPG that's coming out in the first quarter of next year is something that I'm really looking forward to, so that may come up there. Okay, so that's 10 gaming questions that you asked me that I have now answered. If you want me to elaborate on any of the answers that I had for today's video, please let me know in the comments below. And if you have any questions that you'd like me to ask in a future video, please post them in the comments below because, you know what? I might just make one of these videos again. Most of all, I hope you guys really enjoyed this video, and if this is your first time on the channel, please consider liking and subscribing to it, and maybe becoming a patron at patreon.com/backlogbattle. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.